There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday afternoon, the quiet hum of a university campus winding down, the familiar weight of a shared earbud nestled in your ear. You don't recognize them as watersheds, as continental divides in the landscape of your own heart. They feel like just another step on a well-worn path. It's only later, when you look back from a future you could never have predicted, that you see the precise coordinate where everything changed. For me, that coordinate was marked by the sudden, deafening absence of a bass line and the sound of my own name, spoken as if it were a secret he was telling only himself. We were sitting on the low stone wall that bordered the Arts Quad, a place I often went to sketch, and he often came to find me. The late autumn sun was casting long, apologetic shadows across the grass, and the air had that crisp, brittle quality that promises winter is waiting just around the corner. We had just come from a brutal thermodynamics lecture, a class Alex was taking for his engineering degree and I was taking because the university, in its infinite wisdom, believed a photography major needed a foundational understanding of entropy. He was leaning against the rough-hewn stone, shoulder pressed lightly against mine, his gaze lost somewhere in the canopy of a golden-leafed maple. I had the left earbud, he had the right. It was our ritual, a silent communion set to the soundtrack of whatever obscure indie band I had discovered that week. The music was a bridge between our two very different worlds, a shared language when our own vocabularies sometimes failed. The song was a gentle, melancholic piece, full of echoing guitar and a soft, pleading vocal. It was the kind of music that felt like mist, something that could fill the spaces between people without demanding attention. His thumb must have brushed the center of his phone screen, a simple, accidental motion. The music cut out. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was immense, far louder than the song had ever been. It was a physical pressure against my eardrums. I started to pull the earbud out, assuming he was going to say something about the lecture, or about swim practice, or about the project that was slowly draining the life from his eyes. I was already forming a response in my head, something casual and non-committal. But he didn't speak. Not right away. The silence stretched, thin and taut, for a few seconds that felt like geological time. His shoulder was still against mine, a point of warmth in the cooling air. I could feel the subtle rhythm of his breathing, a steady, living metronome. I turned my head to look at him, and his eyes, which were usually a vibrant, restless blue, the color of a summer sky over an ocean, were fixed on me. They were different. The usual storm of calculations and anxieties that I could always see churning just behind the surface was gone. In its place was something still, something deep and unervingly clear. It was like looking down into a well and finally seeing the bottom. Then he spoke. Leo, it wasn't a question. It wasn't an exclamation. It was just my name, breathed into the small space between us. It was so soft, the sound barely disturbed the air, yet it landed in my chest with the force of a physical blow. He said it with a kind of quiet wonder, as if he'd just discovered the word and was testing its shape, its texture, its weight on his tongue. In that single, whispered syllable, I heard a confession, a question, and a plea all at once. And in that moment, the entire, carefully constructed architecture of our friendship, with its load-bearing walls of plausible deniability and its comfortable, platonic floor plan, began to tremble. The ordinary Tuesday afternoon was over. The watershed had been reached. I just didn't know which way the river was going to flow. To understand the tremor that went through me, you have to understand the ground on which we stood. Alex and I had been friends for 2 years, and for precisely 2 years, I had been quietly, hopelessly in love with him. It was a fact I had packed away into a small, lightless room in the back of my mind, a room I never visited. I had sealed the door and painted over the cracks, convincing myself it was just storage for an emotion I no longer needed. Our friendship was too important, too much of a rare and fragile thing, to risk burdening it with the weight of my own inconvenient heart. He was Alex. He was the swimmer, the coder, the one who moved through the world with an easy, unconscious grace that drew people to him like moths to a flame. And I was Leo, the quiet observer, the one who lived behind a camera lens, more comfortable documenting life than participating in it. We were an unlikely pair, a study in contrasts, and that, I told myself, was the foundation of our bond. It was safe. We met in a mandatory public speaking class our freshman year, a crucible of collegiate anxiety designed to terrify introverts like me. I was dreading my first speech, a 5-minute presentation on the principles of composition in photography. My hands were slick with sweat, my notes a blur of incomprehensible ink. Alex was scheduled to go right before me. He strode to the front of the room, all broad shoulders and confident energy, and delivered a flawless, charismatic speech about the fluid dynamics of a perfect freestyle stroke. He used his hands, he made eye contact, he even cracked a joke that made the professor smile. He was everything I was not: poised, articulate, effortlessly at ease in his own skin. When he finished to a round of applause, he walked back to his seat, which happened to be next to mine, and as I stood up on trembling legs, he caught my eye and gave me a small, encouraging nod. "You got this," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. I did not, in fact, have it. I stammered. I dropped my note cards. I stared blankly at a point on the back wall for what felt like an eternity. It was a disaster. But when I slumped back into my seat, face burning with humiliation, Alex didn't laugh or look away. He leaned over slightly. "Hey," he said quietly. "The part about the rule of thirds? I actually understood that. Made sense. It was a small kindness, a lifeline thrown into a sea of embarrassment, and I clung to it." After class, he waited for me by the door. "Seriously," he said, "I'm useless with anything creative. How do you know where to put things in a picture to make it look good?" And just like that, we were talking. Our conversation flowed from photography to swimming, from the brutalist architecture of the science building to the way the light hit the water in the natatorium at dawn. It was easy, frighteningly easy. Our friendship grew in the interstitial spaces of college life. In the library, where I'd help him format a paper while he'd explain a physics concept that was eluding me. In the dining hall, where he'd steal fries from my tray and I'd listen to him vent about his coach. On the long walks across campus, where our gaits, his long and athletic, mine slower and more deliberate, found a shared rhythm. I learned the topography of his moods, the quiet intensity before a big meet, the frustrated energy when a line of code wouldn't compile, the rare, unguarded softness when he talked about his family back home. He was a creature of kinetic energy, always moving, always thinking, his mind a complex engine of logic and discipline. My world, by contrast, was one of stillness, of light and shadow, and the patient waiting for a perfect, fleeting moment to capture. I was the anchor, he was the tide. The love I felt for him grew just as quietly, an invasive species of vine I couldn't seem to eradicate. It started as a simple admiration for his drive and his unexpected kindness. Then it deepened into a profound affection for the person I saw beneath the confident exterior. The one who was lonely despite being surrounded by people. The one who felt the immense pressure of his parents' expectations. The one who sometimes just wanted to be quiet. I saw these things not because he told me, but because I watched him. My photographer's eye was trained to see the truth in the unguarded moment. The slight slump in his shoulders when he thought no one was looking. The way he'd trace patterns on a tabletop when his mind was somewhere else. The flicker of exhaustion in his eyes that his easy smile never quite concealed. I fell in love with the contradictions. He was the star swimmer who hated the smell of chlorine. The brilliant engineer who couldn't figure out how to work my vintage film camera. The social butterfly who seemed most at peace sitting in silence with me, sharing a pair of earbuds. I loved him so much that the thought of him ever finding out felt like a physical threat. To confess would be to change the very nature of our dynamic, to introduce a pressure, an expectation, that our friendship wasn't designed to withstand. It would be like explaining a photograph. The magic would vanish, replaced by a clumsy and inadequate deconstruction. So I said nothing. I built my fortress of silence and lived inside it, content to have him in my life in any capacity, even if it meant a constant, low-grade ache in the center of my chest. I convinced myself that this was enough. And for a long time, it was. We had our routines, our established boundaries. We were best friends. It was a simple, declarative sentence, and we both adhered to its grammar. He dated a girl from his high school, a long-distance relationship that seemed to exist more in theory than in practice. I went on a few awkward, forgettable dates with people from my art classes. Our lives ran on parallel tracks, close enough to offer comfort and support, but distinct. The lines were clear, until they weren't. The shift began subtly, a gradual change in atmospheric pressure that you feel in your bones before the storm arrives. It started in the spring of our sophomore year. Alex's already demanding schedule became punishing. He was taking a notoriously difficult course load. His coach was pushing the team harder than ever for the upcoming championships, and he was a finalist in a prestigious national coding competition that consumed his nights. The pressure was immense, a physical weight I could see settling on his shoulders, pressing him down. At the same time, his long-distance relationship with Sarah finally dissolved. There was no dramatic fight, no tearful breakup call. It just faded out, like a photograph left too long in the sun. He mentioned it to me once, a passing comment over lunch. "Yeah, Sarah and I are done, I guess," he said, pushing a piece of lettuce around his plate. We just kind of stopped talking. He didn't seem heartbroken, just empty. It was another energy source that had been cut off, another demand on his time that had vanished, leaving a void. That void, I soon realized, was where I came in. He started seeking out my quiet company with a new kind of urgency. It was no longer just about meeting for lunch or studying together. It became about him appearing at my dorm room door late at night, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, a laptop under his arm. "Hey," he'd say, his voice rough with fatigue. "Mind if I work in here for a bit? My roommate's got people over." It's too loud to think, of course I didn't mind. My room was a small, Spartan space I'd made my own. My photographs were taped to the walls, my books were stacked in precarious towers, and a single, comfortable armchair was tucked into a corner by the window. It was my sanctuary, and it became his. At first, he would work at my small desk while I sketched or edited photos on my bed. The space would be filled with a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the frantic clicking of his keyboard and the soft scratch of my charcoal on paper. But as the weeks wore on, the invisible boundary between his space and my space began to erode. He'd migrate from the desk to the floor, leaning his back against the side of my bed. Then, one night, he looked up from his screen, his face pale with exhaustion, and asked, "Is it cool if I?" He gestured vaguely toward the empty half of my mattress. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. But I just shrugged, feigning a casualness that felt like a betrayal of every nerve ending in my body. "Yeah, sure. Whatever." So he moved onto the bed, propping himself up against the wall with my pillows, his laptop balanced on his knees. The geography of the room had been redrawn. Now we were sharing the same small island in the quiet sea of the night. The air grew thick with unspoken things. I was intensely, painfully aware of him. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, just inches from mine. I could smell the faint, clean scent of the soap he used, a smell that would forever be intertwined in my memory with the low hum of a laptop fan and the soft glow of a screen in a dark room. I tried to focus on my work, to treat his presence as nothing more than a new piece of furniture, but it was impossible. He was a magnetic field, and every atom in my body was reorienting itself toward him. This became the new normal, our unspoken ritual. 2 or 3 nights a week, he would appear at my door, a ghost haunting the hallways of the dorm, and I would let him in. He'd settle on my bed, and we'd work in tandem, 2 solitary lighthouses beaming our signals into the night from the same rocky outcrop. He rarely spoke about the pressure he was under, but I could see it in the tense set of his jaw, the way he'd rub his eyes until they were red. He didn't need to talk. He just needed to be in a space where nothing was asked of him, where silence was a comfort, not a void. My room became that space. I became that space. And I was terrified. Terrified of what it meant, terrified of what I was beginning to hope it meant, and terrified that I was constructing an elaborate fantasy out of the simple, practical needs of a stressed-out friend. The ritual escalated. One night, deep past 2 in the morning, I looked over and saw that his head had slumped against the wall, his laptop sliding from his lap. His face, in the soft light of my desk lamp, was stripped of all its usual confidence. He looked young and vulnerable, his mouth slightly open, his breathing deep and even. He was completely asleep. I watched him for a long time, my heart a dull, heavy ache in my chest. I didn't have the heart to wake him. So I carefully lifted his laptop and set it on the floor, turned off my desk lamp, and slid under the covers on the far side of the bed, leaving him to sleep on top of the duvet. I lay there for hours, rigid and sleepless, listening to him breathe, a universe away from him on our tiny, shared island. This happened again and again. It became part of the ritual. He would work until he couldn't keep his eyes open, and I would let him sleep. He'd wake up in the early hours of the morning, disoriented, and murmur an apology. "Sorry, man. I crashed." I'd just shake my head. "It's fine. Get some rest." He would leave before the sun came up, slipping out of my room and back to his own, leaving behind a lingering warmth on the bedding and a profound sense of confusion in his wake. What were we doing? What was this strange, intimate, and entirely undefined thing we were building between us? Was I just a convenience? A quiet room and a comfortable bed? Or was I something more? My mind became a courtroom, with hope and fear as the opposing counsels, each presenting compelling, contradictory evidence. I was the jury, and I was hopelessly deadlocked. The physical proximity was a sweet and brutal torture. Every accidental brush of his hand against mine sent a jolt through my system. Every time he shifted in his sleep and his arm fell across my back, my breath would catch in my throat. I was living in a state of hyper-awareness, my senses dialed up to an unbearable sensitivity. I knew the exact cadence of his breathing as he slept. I knew the way a single lock of his dark hair fell across his forehead. I knew the faint scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood swimming accident. I was collecting these details like precious artifacts, cataloging them in the museum of my secret affection. I was a cartographer mapping a land I knew I could never claim to own, but the act of mapping it, of knowing its every contour and feature, felt like a form of possession in itself. The true turning point in the ritual, the moment that moved it from a series of convenient coincidences into something undeniably intentional, happened on a cold, rainy night in April. The coding competition was the next day. Alex was a wreck. He showed up at my door shivering, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face ashen. He wasn't carrying his laptop. He just stood there, looking lost. "I can't," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I can't look at it anymore. My brain is just static." I pulled him inside and sat him down on the edge of the bed. I didn't know what to do. I made him some tea, the way my mom used to do for me when I was sick. He held the warm mug in his trembling hands, staring into it, as if it held the answers to the universe. We sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the rain lashing against the window pane and the quiet, ragged sound of his breathing. Finally, he set the mug down and lay back on the bed, pulling my comforter up to his chin. He curled onto his side, facing away from me. I sat in the armchair, watching the rain streak down the glass, giving him space. After about an hour, his voice came out of the darkness, small and muffled by the pillow. "Leo, yeah, it's cold." It was a simple statement of fact, but I knew it was more than that. It was an invitation, a test. The door to that locked room in my mind creaked open. I could keep it closed, stay in the chair, maintain the safe distance, or I could walk through it. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady, and crossed the small room. I slid into the bed behind him, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I hesitated for a moment, my body held rigid, an inch of cold air separating us. Then, slowly, tentatively, he shifted backward, closing that final inch. His back pressed against my chest. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of profound release, and in that single exhalation, I felt the tension drain out of him. He was still, and so was I. This was new territory. Before, there had always been the pretense of accidental sleep, of exhaustion taking over. This was different. This was a conscious choice. We lay like that for hours, two spoons nestled together against the cold, listening to the ring. I did not sleep. I was too alive, too aware of the solid, living weight of him against me, of the way my arm was curled around his waist, my hand resting lightly on his stomach. I could feel the rise and fall of his chest with every breath. This was a place beyond friendship, a quiet, uncharted country where the rules were unknown. There was no plausible deniability here. This was a deliberate act of seeking and giving comfort, an intimacy so profound it made my bones ache. He had knocked on a door I had long since bricked over, and I had, against all my better judgment, let him in. I didn't know if he was just visiting or if he intended to stay. All I knew was that for the first time in 2 years, the constant, low-grade ache in my chest had been replaced by a terrifying, soaring hope. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that if he left, the silence he left behind would be unbearable. That night became the new template. The pretense of working was often abandoned. He would come to my room simply to lie down, to be still. He would curl up against me, and I would hold him, and we would drift in a quiet space between wakefulness and sleep. We never spoke of it. In the morning, it was as if a collective amnesia had set in. We would talk about classes, about swimming, about anything and everything except for what had happened just hours before. We were like two people trying to build a house in the dark, our hands fumbling over the same materials, a silent, desperate understanding passing between us, but with no blueprint to guide us. The structure we were building was fragile, its foundation built on ambiguity and unspoken need. I knew it was unsustainable. I knew that eventually, the sun would rise, and we would have to look at what we had built in the clear, unforgiving light of day. I just kept praying for the night to last a little longer. And so we returned to the stone wall, to the silence after the music stopped. We returned to his eyes, clear and deep, and to the sound of my name on his lips. It was autumn now, months after that first rainy night. The ritual had become an integral part of our lives, a silent third partner in our friendship. The intimacy of the nights had begun to bleed into the days, not in grand gestures, but in small, subtle ways. A lingering touch when he handed me a book. The way his eyes would find mine across a crowded room. The fact that we were sitting here, our shoulders and thighs pressed together. A proximity that would have felt charged and daring a year ago, but now felt as natural as breathing. I had grown accustomed to the quiet hum of tension beneath the surface of our friendship, the constant thrum of the unspoken. I had learned to live with it, to navigate by it. But this was different. The silence on the stone wall was not the comfortable, companionable silence of our nights. It was a weighted silence, a focused silence. When he said my name, it wasn't the mumble of a half-asleep friend. It was the deliberate, focused utterance of a man who had finally decided to speak. He had paused the music. He had broken the rhythm of our ordinary ritual. He was looking at me not as a sanctuary or a quiet room, but as a person, as Leo. My own name sounded foreign, alien. Hearing it from him, in that tone, was like seeing my own reflection for the first time. The fortress I had built around my heart, the one I thought was so impenetrable, felt like it was made of sand. The tide was coming in, and I was about to be washed away. Alex. My voice was barely a whisper, a rustle of dry leaves. He didn't say anything else. His gaze dropped from my eyes to my mouth, and that small shift, that fractional change in focus, was the loudest thing he had ever said to me. The world seemed to narrow, to shrink until it contained only the few inches of space between our faces. I could see the faint constellation of freckles across the bridge of his nose. I could see the tiny flecks of gold in the blue of his irises. The air grew thin, and I forgot how to breathe. This was it. This was the moment the sun was rising on our strange, nocturnal house. This was the moment of truth. He started to lean in, a slow, hesitant motion, a question being asked in millimeters. My mind was screaming. A part of me, the old, cautious, self-preservationist part, was yelling at me to pull back, to make a joke, to shatter the tension and retreat to the safety of our friendship. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. Risking this, risking him, was an unimaginable folly. Losing him as a friend would be a wound I wasn't sure I could survive. But another part of me, a part that had been starved for 2 years, a part that had been living on scraps of hope and accidental touches, was roaring with a desperate, terrifying joy. It was this part that held me still. It was this part that made me close my eyes. And then his lips were on mine. It was not a passionate kiss. It was not demanding or confident. It was tentative, soft, and breathtakingly gentle. It was a kiss of pure inquiry. It was the physical manifestation of the way he had spoken my name, a quiet discovery. His lips were chapped from the autumn wind, and the touch was so light it was barely there, a ghost of a pressure, a suggestion. But it was enough. It was everything. A current of warmth spread through my entire body, a slow, melting sensation, as if a glacier I hadn't even known was inside me was finally breaking apart. I felt a single, perfect tear escape from the corner of my eye and trace a cold path down my temple. He pulled back just as gently as he had leaned in. He kept his eyes closed for a moment longer, as if savoring the memory, before opening them to look at me. His expression was one of raw, unguarded vulnerability. The confident athlete, the brilliant coder, was gone. In his place was just Alex, looking at me with a fear and a hope so profound it mirrored my own. He had crossed the line. We had crossed it together. And we were standing on the other side, in a new and unfamiliar landscape, with no map and no compass. The ruins of our old, safe friendship behind us. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was vibrating with the echo of that single, gentle touch, a note that would hang in the air between us forever. The aftermath was not a celebration. It was a retreat. The beautiful, terrifying vulnerability of that moment on the stone wall was too much to sustain. It was like staring directly into the sun. We were both blinded, and we both recoiled. The walk back to the dorms was conducted in a strained, fragile silence. We didn't touch. We didn't look at each other. When we reached the hallway that split toward our respective rooms, he stopped. I have to study, he stammered, his eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. It was a flimsy excuse. We both knew it. But I nodded, unable to summon any words. He practically fled down the hallway, disappearing into his room without a backward glance. The sound of his door clicking shut was like a gunshot in the quiet hall. And just like that, the ritual was broken. He didn't come to my room that night, or the next. My texts went unanswered, met with a digital silence that felt more damning than any angry reply could have. I saw him once in the dining hall, sitting with his teammates. He glanced up, our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and he immediately looked away, his face a mask of impenetrable neutrality. It was a public rejection, a clear and brutal signal. He was rebuilding the walls. He was erasing what had happened. And with every hour that passed, the beautiful, fragile hope that had bloomed in my chest began to wither and die, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. I had been a fool. My mind, which had been a deadlocked jury, now delivered a swift, unanimous verdict, guilty of gross misinterpretation. I had mistaken his need for comfort for a desire for me. I had projected my own feelings onto his exhaustion and loneliness. The kiss, I told myself, was an aberration, a moment of weakness, a confused impulse he now deeply regretted. He had come to me seeking a safe harbor, and I, in my selfish hope, had tried to turn it into a home. And now he had fled, and I had not only lost the future I had dared to imagine, but I had also irrevocably broken the friendship that had been my most prized possession. The ache in my chest returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a dull, chronic pain I had learned to live with. It was an acute, gaping wound. For 3 days, I existed in a fog of misery. I went to my classes, I went through the motions of my life, but nothing felt real. The world had lost its color, its focus. Every quiet corner of campus reminded me of him. Every song on my playlist felt like a mockery. My room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. It was haunted by the ghost of his presence, by the indentation his head had left on my pillow, by the lingering scent I couldn't seem to wash out of my comforter. The silence he had once come to share with me was now a suffocating presence, a constant reminder of his absence. On the fourth day, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was worse than any confirmation of my fears. I needed to hear it from him. I needed the finality, the clean break. I needed him to tell me I had imagined it all, so I could begin the long, arduous process of forgetting. I walked to his dorm, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. My reflection in the polished wood of his door looked pale and haunted. I raised my hand to knock, my knuckles hovering an inch from the surface. I almost lost my nerve. But then I thought of the way he had looked at me on the wall, the raw vulnerability in his eyes. I had to know if that was real. I knocked. The wait was agonizing. I could hear movement inside, a muffled shuffling. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, the lock clicked, and the door opened a few inches. He was standing there, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His hair was a mess. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on 3 days ago. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. He didn't meet my eyes. "What do you want, Leo?" he asked, his voice flat and lifeless. The coldness of it was a physical blow, but I held my ground. "I want to talk," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected. "Please, Alex. Just for a minute." He hesitated, his hand tightening on the edge of the door. Then, with a sigh that sounded like it was pulled from the depths of his soul, he stepped back and let me in. His room was chaos. Clothes were strewn on the floor, textbooks lay open in abandoned piles, and empty coffee cups littered his desk. It was the physical manifestation of a mind in turmoil. He didn't offer me a seat. He just stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. He was a fortress, and his drawbridge was up. "Look," he started, his gaze fixed on a point over my shoulder. "About the other day, it was a mistake. I was stressed out. I wasn't thinking straight. I'm sorry if I gave you the wrong impression. We should just forget it happened." Every word was a carefully rehearsed line, a sterile, corporate apology designed to neutralize a difficult situation. And it broke me, not with sadness, but with a sudden, surging anger. It was an anger born of hurt, of feeling dismissed, of having something that felt so real and profound reduced to a mistake, the wrong impression. I repeated, my voice shaking with a fury that surprised me. "What impression was that, Alex? And don't you dare tell me to forget it." "I won't. I can't." I finally had his attention. His eyes snapped to mine, wide with surprise. "For months," I continued, the words tumbling out of me now, a dam breaking. "You have been coming to my room. You have been sleeping in my bed. You have been letting me hold you while you sleep. And then you kiss me. You kiss me, and you look at me like you saw me. And then you run. You hide. And you want me to just forget it? To pretend it was nothing?" I took a step closer, invading his defensive space. "I deserve more than that. I deserve more than a pre-written apology you memorized in the hallway. I need you to look at me and tell me the truth. Whatever it is. If it was a mistake, then say it to my face and mean it. Tell me it meant nothing. But don't you dare treat me like I'm crazy. Don't you dare invalidate what has been happening between us for the last 6 months." He stared at me, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. The fortress was crumbling. I could see the panic in his eyes, the confusion, the fear. He looked trapped. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure desperation. "I don't know," he finally whispered, his voice cracking. The sound was so full of despair it extinguished my anger in an instant, leaving only a deep, aching empathy. "Leo, I don't know what's happening." He slid down the wall and sat on the floor, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders began to shake. And for the second time in our friendship, I was watching Alex fall apart. But this time, it wasn't from academic pressure or exhaustion. It was from something deeper, something internal. I crossed the room and sat on the floor in front of him, leaving a respectful distance between us. I waited. After a long time, he looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a desperate, pleading honesty. "I'm so scared," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "All my life, I've had a plan. You know? Swim, get the degree, get a job, get a girlfriend, get married. It's like a checklist. It's what everyone expects. It's what I expected. He gestured vaguely around his chaotic room. And then you. Nothing with you makes sense. It's not on the checklist. Being with you, in your room, it's the only time my brain shuts up. It's the only time I feel calm. Safe, he took a shuddering breath. When I'm with my teammates, or in class, I feel like I'm playing a part. The jock, the smart kid. It's exhausting. With you, I don't have to be anything. I can just be. And that started to feel more real than anything else. And it terrified me, because I didn't know what it was. I didn't have a name for it. He finally looked me directly in the eye, and the vulnerability there was absolute. And then I kissed you. And for 1 second, it was the most right thing I have ever done in my entire life. It was like coming home. And then the panic set in. What does this mean? What am I? What will people say? What will my parents say? I broke. I ran. I'm sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry. I didn't run from you. I ran from myself. His confession hung in the air between us, raw and honest and heartbreaking. He had finally given me the truth. And the truth was not that it meant nothing. The truth was that it meant everything, and the weight of that was what had crushed him. The locked room in my own mind, the one I had stored my feelings in, swung wide open, and I realized it wasn't a prison. It was a shelter. And now, he was standing at the threshold, lost and afraid, and I knew what I had to do. I closed the distance between us and wrapped my arms around him. He stiffened for a second, then collapsed against me, burying his face in my shoulder, and for the first time, he let himself truly cry. Not quiet, sleeping breaths, but wrenching, cathartic sobs. And I just held him. I held him through all of it, stroking his hair, murmuring quiet, meaningless words of comfort. I was his anchor again, but this time, it was different. We were not just weathering an external storm. We were navigating the turbulent, uncharted waters of our own hearts, and we were doing it together. There was no magic fix, no cinematic moment where everything was suddenly resolved. The days that followed his confession were quiet, tentative. We were learning a new language, fumbling with the grammar of a relationship that had no precedent for either of us. We talked. For hours. We talked about his fears, about the pressure he felt, about the carefully constructed identity he was afraid to let go of. And I talked too. For the first time, I told him everything. I told him about the 2 years of silent affection, about the terror of risking our friendship, about the hope that had bloomed and withered and was now, cautiously, beginning to bud again. We laid all our cards on the table, all our fears and hopes and insecurities, until the space between us was no longer filled with ambiguity, but with a fragile, shimmering honesty. The ritual returned, but it was transformed. He still came to my room, but now he knocked first, a small gesture of respect for a boundary that was no longer blurred. He still slept in my bed, but now we faced each other, my hand in his leg tangled with mine. The plausible deniability was gone, replaced by a quiet, deliberate intimacy. We were no longer building a house in the dark. We were building it in the light of day, slowly and carefully, choosing each piece of lumber, testing its strength, making sure the foundation was solid. One evening, about a week after his confession, we were lying in my bed, listening to music, not with shared earbuds, but from the small speaker on my nightstand, the sound filling the whole room, belonging to both of us. He was tracing the lines on my palm with his finger, a thoughtful, absent-minded gesture. He was quiet for a long time, and then he propped himself up on his elbow and looked down at me. "Can I kiss you again?" he asked, his voice soft, but clear and certain. There was no hesitation in his eyes this time, no fear, just a simple, honest question. "Yes," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. And he did. It was not like the first kiss. This one was not an inquiry. It was a statement. It was a promise. It was full of all the words we had finally learned to say to each other, a confirmation of the new, solid ground we had found. It was gentle and deep and sure, a kiss that felt like the beginning of everything. When he pulled away, he didn't retreat. He settled back down beside me, pulled me close, and pressed his forehead against mine. His breathing was even, calm. He felt settled. A few nights later, another small, significant shift occurred. We were getting ready for sleep, a comfortable domesticity settling over us. I was already in bed, and he was brushing his teeth in my small, attached bathroom. When he came out, he walked over to the door to the hallway, which I always left slightly ajar out of old habit. He reached out and pushed it closed until we heard the soft, definitive click of the latch engaging. He turned back to me, a small, quiet smile on his face. The door was closed. The world was shut out. This room, our room, was a private, protected space now. It was ours. In the end, that's what it all came down to. It wasn't about grand declarations or dramatic changes. It was about the slow, patient process of healing. It was about learning that love isn't a destination you arrive at, but a shelter you build together, one honest conversation, one gentle touch, one closed door at a time. He had come to me looking for a sanctuary from the storm of his life, and somewhere along the way, without either of us realizing it, we had become a sanctuary for each other. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of the quiet, steady rhythm of two hearts that had finally, miraculously, found their way home.